3 miles beneath the Pacific Ocean lies one of the greatest secrets of the Cold War. A Soviet nuclear submarine carrying missiles, encryption machines, and military secrets vanished without a trace. The Soviet Union searched for weeks and found nothing. But somewhere else, another nation was listening. What they discovered on the ocean floor would trigger one of the boldest intelligence missions ever attempted. A mission so impossible that even the engineers asked to build it believed it couldn't be done. It would cost billions of dollars, require technology that didn't exist, and depend on a lie so convincing that it fooled the entire world. Yet after years of planning, when success was finally within reach, the ocean fought back. History remembers the victories. Dark Atlas uncovers the secrets buried beneath them. If you're fascinated by forgotten history, secret intelligence operations, and real stories that sound too unbelievable to be true, subscribe to Dark Atlas. Every week we uncover remarkable events hidden beneath the surface of history. Now, let's begin. The Cold War wasn't only fought with missiles, it was fought in silence. Hidden beneath the world's oceans, submarines carried enough nuclear firepower to change history in minutes. In February 1968, one of those submarines left a Soviet naval base for what should have been a routine patrol. Its name was K-129. On board were 98 sailors, fathers, sons, engineers, and officers. None of them knew they were beginning their final voyage. Days later, all communications stopped. No distress signal, no emergency transmission, only silence. The Soviet Navy launched one of its largest search operations, sending ships and aircraft across thousands of square miles of ocean. Every possible explanation was considered, but the submarine had simply disappeared. Eventually, Moscow accepted the unthinkable. K-129, its crew and its nuclear secrets were gone forever. Or so they believed. Thousands of miles away, the United States had been listening through a classified underwater surveillance network known as SOSUS. Hidden sensors detected a violent acoustic event deep beneath the Pacific. Using that information, the submarine US Halibut located K-129 resting more than 16,000 feet below the surface. Inside was a treasure unlike anything the CIA had ever seen. But finding it was the easy part. The real question was far more dangerous. Could anyone steal an entire submarine from the bottom of the ocean? The CIA quickly realized that recovering K-129 could change the balance of the Cold War. Hidden inside the submarine were encryption machines, codebooks, sonar technology, and nuclear weapons that American intelligence had spent years trying to understand. But there was one problem. The submarine rested nearly 3 miles below the Pacific, where the pressure exceeded 7,000 pounds per square inch. No ship had ever attempted to lift something so massive from such an extreme depth. Many engineers believed it was simply impossible. Instead of abandoning the idea, the CIA decided to build a machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The operation received a highly classified name, Project Azorian. But building such an enormous vessel would immediately attract Soviet attention. The CIA needed a cover story convincing enough to explain why anyone would spend hundreds of millions of dollars constructing the largest ship of its kind. Their answer was one of the world's most famous billionaires, Howard Hughes. Known for his wealth, secrecy, and unusual business ventures, Hughes was the perfect disguise. Publicly, he announced an ambitious plan to mine valuable manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The story sounded strange, but believable. Newspapers covered the project. Investors discussed the future of deep-sea mining. Even the Soviet Union accepted the explanation. Behind the scenes, however, every blueprint, every weld, and every steel beam served a completely different purpose. The Hughes Glomar Explorer wasn't designed to collect minerals. It was built to steal a Soviet submarine. Hidden inside the ship was an enormous chamber called the Moon Pool, completely concealed from anyone outside the vessel. Through this opening, a gigantic mechanical capture vehicle would be lowered into the darkness. Engineers nicknamed it Clementine. Stretching nearly 180 feet long and built from some of the strongest steel ever produced, Clementine resembled a giant claw. Its job was to wrap around the shattered submarine and lift thousands of tons back toward the surface. Nothing about the mission was simple. Nearly 300 sections of heavy steel pipe had to be connected one by one, forming a single column almost 3 miles long. The ship also needed a revolutionary positioning system capable of holding its location within a few feet despite waves, currents, and wind. Technology developed for Project Azorian would later transform the offshore drilling industry, but in 1974 it had never been tested on this scale. Finally, after years of planning, construction, and secrecy, the Glomar Explorer reached the recovery site. Far above, Soviet surveillance ships watched from a distance, believing they were observing nothing more than an unusual mining expedition. Beneath them, the greatest covert recovery mission in history was about to begin. Neither side knew that the next few days would decide whether Project Azorian became one of the CIA's greatest triumphs, or its most expensive failure. The descent took days. One by one, hundreds of massive steel pipe sections disappeared into the Pacific, carrying Clementine toward a submarine that hadn't seen daylight since 1968. Nearly 16,500 feet below the surface, cameras finally revealed the twisted hull of K-129, resting silently on the ocean floor. Slowly, the giant claw moved into position. Its massive arms closed around the submarine, and the long journey back to the surface began. For a moment, the impossible became reality. Thousands of tons of steel slowly rose from the abyss, while the Glomar Explorer held its position with remarkable precision. Above the recovery site, Soviet ships watched from a distance, completely unaware that their lost submarine was hanging beneath the American vessel. After years of planning and billions of dollars, Project Azorian was on the verge of success. Then, everything changed. As the submarine climbed through the crushing depths, enormous stress built inside both the damaged hull and the capture vehicle itself. Without warning, several of Clementine's massive steel arms fractured. The weakened submarine broke apart. In seconds, nearly 2/3 of K-129 slipped from the claw and disappeared back into the darkness forever. The missiles, command center, and the highly sought-after cryptographic equipment crashed back to the ocean floor, beyond anyone's reach. Silence filled the control room. Years of planning had ended in a single catastrophic failure. Yet, the mission wasn't over. The forward section of the submarine remained secured inside the claw and was carefully pulled into the hidden moon pool. Inside, the CIA recovered valuable equipment, structural components, and 2 nuclear torpedoes. They also discovered the remains of 6 Soviet sailors. Instead of treating them as enemies, the crew conducted a formal military burial at sea. Wrapped with respect, the sailors were honored with prayers, military traditions, and even the Soviet national anthem. Nearly 2 decades later, the CIA presented the burial footage to Russian President Boris Yeltsin as a gesture of respect after the Cold War. When details of the mission leaked in 1975, the CIA refused to answer questions. Giving a response that would become famous around the world, we can neither confirm nor deny the existence or non-existence of the requested records. That single sentence became known as the Glomar response, and it remains a standard reply used by intelligence agencies to this day. Although Project Azorian never recovered the entire submarine, it proved that engineering could achieve what many believed was impossible. It pushed the limits of deep-sea technology, influenced modern offshore drilling, and became one of the boldest intelligence operations ever attempted. Sometimes history isn't defined by perfect success. Sometimes it's remembered because someone dared to attempt the impossible. If you enjoyed uncovering this forgotten Cold War mystery, subscribe to Dark Atlas for more true stories hidden beneath history. And here's a question for you. If you had been leading Project Azorian, would you have risked billions of dollars to recover the submarine, knowing there was a chance everything could be lost in a single moment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one,